In such cases of the replacement of natural services by money payments, the advantage is usually mutual. This is a most remarkable fact which calls for an analysis within a wider context. If one starts out from the assumption that the quantity of goods available for consumption is limited, that this quantity does not satisfy the given demands, that, finally, the world has been given away, that is, that in general every good has its owner, then it follows that whatever is given to one person must be taken away from another. Even if one disregards all cases where this obviously does not hold, there still remain countless others where the satisfaction of one person's needs is at the expense of that of another. If one were to consider this as one characteristic or basis of our economic life, then it would accord with all those worldviews that hold as immutable the total amount of values given to mankind, such as ethics, happiness, knowledge, so that only the forms and agents of these values can change. Schopenhauer is inclined to assume that the amount of suffering and joy that each individual experiences is predetermined by his essential nature, that this amount can neither be exceeded nor remain void, and that all extraneous circumstances to which we are accustomed to ascribe our situation only represent a difference in the form in which we experience that unchangeable amount of happiness and sorrow. If one extends this individualistic conception to mankind as a whole, then it appears as if all our striving for happiness, all evolution of material conditions, all the struggle for possessions and being is a mere shifting back and forth of values whose total amount cannot be changed in this way. As a result, all changes in distribution merely reflect the basic phenomenon that one person now owns what the other, voluntarily or not, has given away. This conservation of values obviously corresponds to a pessimistic quietistic view of life, for the less we consider ourselves able to produce really new values, the more important it is that none are really lost. The widespread notion in India that, if a holy ascetic yields to temptation his merits are transferred to the tempter, teaches this with paradoxical consistency. But exactly opposite phenomena must also be considered. In all those emotional relationships where happiness lies not only in what one receives but just as much in what one gives, where each is mutually and equally enriched by the others, there develops a value the enjoyment of which is not bought by any deprivation on the part of an opposite party. Similarly, the communication of intellectual matters does not mean that something has to be taken from one person so that another can enjoy it. At least, only an almost pathological sensibility can bring about a feeling of deprivation if an objective intellectual idea is no longer an exclusive personal property but is also shared by others. Generally speaking, one may assert that intellectual property, at least to the extent that it does not extend into economic property, is not gained at the expense of others, since it is not taken from a limited supply but, even though its content is given, ultimately has to be produced by the thought process of whoever acquires it. This harmonization of interests, which emanates from the nature of the object, should obviously also be provided in those economic spheres where competition for the satisfaction of individual needs is gained only at the expense of someone else. There are two types of means for transferring this situation into a more perfect one. The nearest at hand is the diversion of the struggle against fellow men towards the struggle against nature. To the extent to which further substances and forces are incorporated into human uses from the available supply of nature, competition for those that are already obtained will be reduced. The thesis of the preservation of material and energy is, luckily, valid only for the absolute total of nature, but not for that section of it which human purposive action designates. This relative total can, indeed, be multiplied indefinitely by bringing more material and forces into a form that accords with our purposes, that is by annexing them. A progressive technology teaches us to gain even more uses for things, even from what is already completely occupied. The transition from an extensive to an intensive economy is applicable not only to the cultivation of the land, but to any substance that can be subdivided into smaller and smaller parts for more and more specific usages, or to the substance's latent forces that are to be released to an even greater extent. The extension of human spheres of power in a variety of dimensions, which belies both the statement that the world is given away free and that the satisfaction of needs is tied to theft of whatever sort, could be termed the substantive progress of culture. Alongside this, there is what might be termed fundamental progress. The concern here is with finding the appropriate forms that make it advantageous for both parties to exchange ownership of specific objects. Such a form can originally have been attained only if the first owner had the physical power to keep the object wanted by others until he was offered a corresponding advantage, because otherwise the object would simply have been taken away from him. Robbery, and perhaps the gift, appear to be the most primitive stages of change in ownership, the advantage lying completely on one side and the burden falling completely on the other. When the stage of exchange appears as the form of change in ownership, or as stated earlier as a mere consequence of when the stage of exchange appears as the form of change in ownership, or as stated earlier as a mere consequence of the equal power of both parties, then this would be evidence of the greatest progress that mankind could have made. In view of the mere differences of degree that exist in so many respects between man and the lower animals, many have often attempted to establish the specific difference that separates mankind unmistakably and unequivocally from other animals. Thus, man has been defined as the political animal, the tool-creating animal, the purposeful animal, the hierarchical animal, indeed, by a serious philosopher, as the megalomaniac animal. Perhaps we might add to this series that man is the exchanging animal, and this is in fact only one side or form of the whole general feature which seems to reflect the specific qualities of man. Man is the objective animal. Nowhere in the animal world do we find indications of what we term objectivity, of views and treatment of things that lie beyond subjective feeling and volition. I have already indicated how this reduces the human tragedy of competition. Such is the civilizing influence of culture that more and more contents of life become objectified in superindividual forms: books, art, ideal concepts such as fatherland, general culture, the manifestation of life in conceptual and aesthetic images, the knowledge of 1,000 interesting and significant things. All this may be enjoyed without any one depriving any other. The more values are transposed into such objective forms, the more room there is in them, as in the house of God, for every soul. Perhaps the wildness and embitterment of modern competition would be completely unbearable were it not accompanied by this growing objectivation of the contents of existence which remain untouched by all Ottoi Jemy meta. It is surely of deep significance that whatever separates man on the purely factual and psychological level from lower animal species, namely the capacity for objective contemplation, the disregard of the ego with its impulses and conditions in favor of pure objectivity, contributes to the noblest and most ennobling result in the historical process: to build a world that may be acquired without conflict and mutual repression, to possess values whose acquisition and enjoyment by one person does not exclude that of another, but opens the door 1,000 times for him to acquire such values as well. This problem, which is successfully solved in the world of objectivity in a substantial form, comes close to a solution in a functional form. In contrast to the simple taking away or gift, in which the purely subjective impulse is enjoyed, exchange presupposes, as we saw earlier, an objective appraisal, consideration, mutual acknowledgement, a restraint of direct subjective desire. It does not matter that originally this may not be voluntary but enforced by the equal power of the other party. Rather, the decisive, specifically common factor is that this equivalence of power does not lead to mutual theft and struggle but to a balanced exchange in which the one-sided and personal possession or desire for possession enters into an objective concerted action arising out of and beyond the interaction of the subjects. Exchange, which to us appears to be something entirely self-evident, is the first, and in its simplicity really wonderful, means for combining justice with changes in ownership. In so far as the receiver is, at the same time, the giver, the mere one-sidedness of advantage that characterizes changes of ownership dominated by a purely impulsive egotism or altruism disappears, though this does not imply that the latter relationship is always the first stage of development. The maximization of value through changes in ownership, but the mere justice that is implied in exchange is certainly only formal and relative. Any one person should have neither more nor less than any other. Over and above that, exchange brings about an increase in the absolute number of values experienced. Since everybody offers for exchange only what is relatively useless to him, and accepts in exchange what is relatively necessary, exchange affects it continuously.